Well, all right, and welcome to our first virtual class lecture, whatever you want to call it, for the sensation and perception course, or as I have titled it here, the psychology of perception. But the difference in that title, I think we're going to get to here in this first set of notes. Now, what I want to do, this whole set of notes here is really meant to be something that roughly kind of goes with chapter one a little bit, this kind of introduction. But what I want to do is I want to talk about a couple of things. One is just the really obvious idea of what is this whole topic of this course about. It's about perception, right? And we need to understand that. We need to understand even what it is and define it. But perception is something that I think it's pretty easy to take for granted, right? We can look at something. I'm just going to grab some random things off of my desk. I'm sure you probably can't see that. I've got a little, I don't know what it's made out of, might be obsidian carving of a turtle, right? And it's not too difficult to look at this thing and just immediately look at that and say, oh, it's a little turtle sculpture, right? Well, the question is, how do we do this? And the more that we think about exactly what is involved in being able to just look at an object and say, that's a turtle sculpture, or that's a car, or that's a tree, or that's a flower, or that's my my brother, it's practically miraculous when we think about exactly the challenges faced by visual systems and brains. And of course, here I'm just limiting it to vision. But of course, we have more than simply just vision when it comes to different sensory or organs or receptors that can access information in the environment or energy from the environment. Obviously, hearing and touch, taste, and smell, and all of these kinds of things. It's another question entirely is, you learn about the five senses practically in kindergarten, probably. And maybe little did you know that that was your first lesson in psychology. But in this situation, the idea is it's one thing to talk about having five senses, but how do they work? Are we limited really to just those five? That's maybe a question that's not super interesting. I mean, maybe it is a little interesting. It's not a critical question, perhaps, but we can talk about it a little bit. Well, let's get into this a little bit here. So first, what's perception? Why are we studying perception? I just said that when you learn about the five senses, this perhaps unknowingly was your first introduction to psychology, but in some cases we might think, since when is that part of psychology? Well, it is, of course, because first and foremost, it involves the brain, right? I just said that, right? The idea is that your eyes detect information in terms of light reflecting from an object and transmits that information into your brain, where you then have to develop some visual awareness and perceptual awareness of the object. But of course, that also means that when it comes to just recognizing an object, we also means we're accessing some conceptual knowledge as well, right? Because when I look at my little obsidian turtle sculpture, I am accessing information about turtles, right? I have to remember the word, and I have a whole kind of conceptual definition of what turtles are and what they look like. And I also understand that there's actually different kinds of turtles that look very different from each other. In fact, my little sculpture only superficially resembles a real life turtle. And so how in the world am I able to make a comparison between this thing and a real world turtle when they have as many differences as they do similarities, right? So the question, of course, is what is it that the visual system is actually detecting and understanding when it comes to finding these visual patterns and making connections to other visual patterns so that I can essentially recognize, right? And recognition We're going to see this when talking about object recognition. This comes up in a later chapter, but we could talk about it a little here too. And especially with machine vision, object recognition, or image classification schemes, right? Computers can recognize. And one thing that we want to think about is how do they do that, and what kinds of they engage in what are called image classification schemes. And that means that they can recognize that there are some kinds of objects that have basically what we might consider to be essential features that make them a member of a category or class of objects. And that's what we mean by classification, right? Is for a computer to look at something and say, that's a turtle, and this other thing is not a turtle, it's something else, maybe it's a dog or a chair, means that it is able to recognize whatever those essential determining characteristics are that make a particular object part of a class of things, even though all of those objects within that class of things can be very different from each other. You think about dogs, and dogs look different from other dogs, right? But nevertheless, they all must have some certain feature so that when we look at them, we're like, yeah, okay, that's a dog. Of course, what's curious is that they also have a lot of features that might overlap with other categories like cats. And visual systems tend to have very little problem discriminating dogs and cats. Even though they have lots of similar features, there are still other dissimilar features that can be used to distinctly categorize dog versus cat. Think about chairs. I mentioned that, I think I said that a second ago. There's all kinds of different chairs. You have a chair that you have maybe for your dining room table, have a desk chair for sitting at a computer. You got the easy chair in the living room. You got the kind of standard desk chairs you find in a classroom. Maybe you have a camp chair, kind of folding camp chair things, right? Stools, and so on and so forth, right? So all of these chairs look, again, pretty drastically different from each other. But nevertheless, we're still able to look at them all and say, okay, there's some set of features they all have that I know that they belong to that category of things called chair. And so we have some sort of higher level cognitive stuff happening inside, is the best I can describe it, really, that sort of defines these categories. And that's how what essentially is, our best of our understanding, drives our visual perception ability, at least when it comes to recognizing. That is, being able to look at something and name it and say what it is. But as it turns out, there's other kinds of things we do with vision. So for example, my ability to reach out and grab this little sculpture turtle is very different from my ability to name it. And what we see, for example, there are certain brain injuries that people can have that are called visual agnosia, or just agnosia in general. And agnosia is a case where somebody has damage, usually to pathways from the visual cortex and the occipital lobe to the temporal lobes of the brain. And what's going on here is that this damage causes an impairment in recognition, right? That's what an agnosia is. And there's specific types of agnosia, like prosopagnosia is specific to faces, but there's others that just are more broad and kind of affect overall object recognition. So this means that a person with really significant agnosia would be able to look, or I should say would not be able to look at an object and name it. But if we ask them to reach out and grab it, what we're going to see is that as they reach for the object, there are things that we know about reaching, for example, that when we reach for a small object versus a large object, this changes the velocity of your reach and the timing of how you slow down as you approach the object. We also shape our grasp accordingly, right? So when an object is more elongated in one dimension, we're going to orient our fingers to grasp it appropriately so we can detect these kinds of shape and orientation features as we reach out to grab an object, as well as size and the speed of our movement. And all of those features of the reach and grasp action remain completely normal, right? So that means a person looks at this object and simply has no idea what it is. They cannot name it, cannot say what it is. But when they reach to grab it, the way in which they reach to grab it reveals that their brain is still processing information about shape, size, orientation, and so forth. So they are still seeing it, and they can still get all of that spatial information and use that spatial information to control their reaching movement, even if they can't use that same information to access all of that classification system stuff that I was talking about, and recognizing features and using features to name and identify things. That's a big thing in and of itself, right? To say that there's two types of systems processing visual information, right? This is called the two-channel theory, as it turns out. We'll talk more about that later on. But, this idea that when we think of perception and psychology, I have barely even addressed what's on this slide. I've just been talking here. So, well, one of the things we have to think about is that, psychology we think of as the study of behavior. I have that right here. But then we say, okay, well, what's behavior? And we usually think of the kind of stuff that I have listed on the right. Like, usually we think of, cognitive psychology, because that talks about how people engage in various cognitive processes of attending to information and remembering information and engaging in reasoning, planning, problem solving, decision making kind of stuff. We might think of social behavior. And so social psychology comes up, and you think about the stuff you study in social psychology and how we interact with others and coordinate our behavior with others and communicate with others and make attributions about other people. And we might even think about more basic biological behaviors like motivational related behaviors, eating and drinking and mating and all these kinds of things that are driven by like the hypothalamus and the brainstem, but that's still part of behavior. So we're saying, of course, that's part of psychology. But what I just said, right? My ability to look at something and identify it and name it, that is a behavior. And we need to have an explanation of that. And that's why this is part of psychology. But also, my ability to reach out and pick something up is also a behavior. And we need to have an explanation for that. And that is also part of psychology. So that's the kind of stuff this class is about, right? And that's why perception is part of psychology, is we want to understand how do we look out, and not just vision. Again, I'm really heavy on the vision here, but I can look at an object and name it, but I can also hear something happening and I can recognize what is happening. Obviously, we can recognize music. I can recognize a human voice, and not just the fact that it's a human voice, but I can recognize the language and understand the meaning of the words and the communication in general. But if I hear somebody knocking on my door, I can tell that that's what that is, right? I know the sound. There's a specific timing when a person knocks on the door compared to, say, other random knocking sounds that might be happening. I don't know, wind's blowing a tree against the side of the house, and that makes a knocking sound, right? But I don't confuse that typically with the sound of somebody giving a quick knock on the door. And if we think about it, there's even more complex patterns going on. There's a difference between a friendly knock versus an aggressive knock on the door, right? So somebody's like bang, bang, bang on your door. You're like, oh my God, what's that? Where if someone's just more like tap, 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 you're like, oh, somebody's at the door, right? So clearly you have a different kind of perception of what's going on there based on the timing and intensity of the door knocking, right? So we're getting a lot of information that's used for perception and action, and that's important here, as well as that just our ability to reach out and grab things is something that, as I mentioned, we take this for granted because we just do it without any effort all day long. We can walk and step over things and climb stairs, and we can reach out and pick things up, and we can catch and throw a ball, and on and on and on. But these kinds of simple motor actions that we perform are driven by perceptual input. We have to see where things are. We have to feel our bodies moving, and of course, feel the objects as we hold them to recognize how we are interacting with it. So it's a lot of behavior that is supported by perception. In a way, you could say effectively all behavior to some degree is supported by perception. Even the stuff I've listed here under cognitive psychology. How am I going to reason or plan about anything without awareness of the world around me? what am I remembering other than remembering events that I have perceived? What do I tend to, except for things that are part of my perceptual experience and reality right now, right? Social stuff requires perception of another. And motivational stuff, if we want to simplify motivational behavior down and the biological world to what we sometimes call approach and avoidance behaviors, right? So eating, drinking, mating are approach behaviors, but say if you're being chased by a predator, you got your fight or flight response, that's an avoidance response, right? So we have an approach and avoidance behaviors. That requires perception. Whoops, sorry, hit the space bar on my keyboard. That requires us to first perceive and recognize what's going on in the world around us, right? In fact, emotional reactions themselves are very much dependent on perceiving and interpreting the world around us. So in fact, this is what I have all listed here, is that some of the more basic stuff, walking, standing, right? Standing, of course, think about it. Stand on, just test this yourself. Stand on the floor, maybe barefoot is a good way to test this. And then just pay attention to things like, what are you feeling with the skin of your feet on the floor itself? Well, one thing you might notice is that depending on the surface of the floor, you might detect a difference in the temperature, like it could be a cool tile floor, or maybe it's carpet. And so you're going to detect the difference in the texture there, the smoothness of tile versus the rough, coarse texture of carpet, but also the tile feels cool and the carpet probably feels, less cool, room temperature, warm, whatever. But then also think about the feeling of pressure that you feel on the foot itself. When you're standing upright, you don't stand rigid like a statue, right? Your posture has a natural slight sway to it. And if you pay attention, we don't usually pay attention, and that's why I say we take this stuff for granted. But if you really think about it for just a second, as you stand and your posture sways a little bit, you're going to feel a little pressure shift to the front of your feet or to the back or maybe to the sides, depending on the direction of your postural sway. But something else that has to happen is that because we have postural sway and we don't just stand rigid upright like a statue, that means we can be at risk of falling. And when we're little kids and we're just learning how to stand for the first time, you're like 10-month-old baby maybe. What do 10-month-old babies do when they stand up? They tend to fall over after not too long, right? So at some point we managed to stop doing this, because what's happening is that we are learning to, even if it's not at the conscious attentional level, to detect these little variations in our postural sway, that shift in our body's center of gravity over our feet. Once it starts to get a little too far forward or backward or to the side, that's when we fall down. But we start to learn to notice these things. And then we make postural corrections. And that's what we're doing all the time, is that we sway one way, but then there's various muscular contractions that occur that steer our bodies back in the other direction to prevent us from tipping over, right? And this is all happening at fairly low levels, but nevertheless, it's still a process that is governed by perception and action, right? Perceptual input coming in from not just feeling your feet on the floor, right? I was talking about that, but also think about the fact that as your body sways a little bit, you're also going to have movement and rotation in your ankles. And you can feel that because all you need to do here is sit and move your feet around and rotate your ankles. All right. And as you rotate your ankle, as you just wave your foot around, then what's happening is you can feel that rotation of the ankle, right? So you can feel that when you're standing up and you're swaying and your legs are moving, but your feet are planted on the floor. There's going to be a little counter rotation of the ankle. Same thing happens though in your knees and your hips as well. As during postural sway, you've got all of these different linkages of the body, and all of those joints have a little bit of rotation and wiggle in them, and you can feel all of it, right? So you feel your feet skin touching the floor. You feel the pressure of your weight shift on the foot itself. You feel the ankle, knee, hip, lower back, even perhaps shoulder. All of that is shifting here and there. But then the things that we are probably a little more obvious, think about the vestibular system, right? So in your inner ears, you have the vestibular system, which we usually think of as our sense of balance. And it turns out it's really an accelerometer, and it can detect things like our position relative to gravity, which is accelerating us straight down. So in that sense, again, we detect that. And also think about vision, right? In a situation where I'm leaning, obviously that means my head is moving forward if I'm leaning forward, right? And that means that anything in front of me is getting closer. And you know what happens when something gets closer to you? It gets a little bit larger, right? Let me use my coffee cup over here, and I'm going to move it to the camera. And so what happens, of course, is it gets closer to the camera, it gets larger in the field of view. Same thing geometrically happens if it's coming to your eyes, right? And so if it's something like a wall in front of you, and if the wall is stable, this wall is not moving, you're the one that's swaying back and forth. But as you sway towards the wall, then that whole wall is going to expand a small amount in your field of view. And you can visually detect that and use that as information about your postural sway as well. In fact, some classic studies that I always talk about in this class, going back to the 70s, by a guy named David Lee in Scotland, is that he invented what we call the moving room experiment. And what he did was he created a false room that had 3 walls and a ceiling, but the floor was just the normal standard floor of the room that the person was in. But the walls and the ceiling were kind of suspended by ropes inside the larger room. And so you bring a person into this moving false room, and they don't know that it's a false room, right? And so now they're in there, and to them, it just looks like they're in a regular room. But from the outside, you start moving this room back and forth, just a small amount. And what happens is that that wall in front of them will come closer to them, right? My hands are trying to simulate this idea that the wall comes at them a little bit. And what we find is that their natural reaction when that wall sways towards them is to lean backwards, because that's what you would normally do if you were swaying forward. And as you sway forward, you get closer to that wall, so it expands in your field of view. So you're like, oh, if I'm falling forward, I better lean back a little bit, right? And so what happens is that you put people in the moving room, and pretty soon they start swaying in synchrony with the room without even realizing they're doing it. And you do this with little toddlers who are just learning how to balance and stand. As I mentioned before, you can make them fall on their butts over and over again, right? So anyway, standing is something that really requires perception, right? Not to mention other things, reaching and throwing, as I had talked about already, and recognizing sounds by hearing. And of course, all of our other senses, we can smell and recognize what it is we are smelling or tasting or eating, and on and on. And these are very fundamental basic behaviors, right? But therefore, it doesn't mean that they occur without any effort or without any processing of information. In fact, they do require a lot of that, and we need to have a psychological theory to explain how it all works. So let's move ahead a little bit here. So the first question, though, is, well, I don't know if this is the first question. It's the next question. The knowledge that we have. We could talk about knowledge being a perceptual process, but philosophically speaking, not all knowledge has been historically thought to be acquired through the senses, right? In fact, there's some arguments to be made, for example, that the senses are not very good. We're going to see this as we get into some of the details later on about how vision works, for example. But, eyes are highly imperfect, and they don't really capture the external world completely accurately, right? And so that means that in order to make up for some of the limits of the visual system and the eyes in terms of how well they do their job, we might think that maybe what has to happen is that if the sensory systems are not so great, maybe we just have to have innate knowledge instead. And so what's going to happen is that in order for us to really know anything, the senses really can't tell us the whole truth of reality. And therefore, there's a lot of stuff that we may have to rely on that is essentially innate knowledge, right? Some of it, for example, boils down to some concepts that are, this especially if we go back to some of the old Greek philosophers, which we really don't want to do in this class, but there are things, for example, that we have conceptual knowledge about. I mentioned conceptual knowledge earlier, right? That would seem to be difficult to explain how it derives from the senses. So, for example, being able to talk about infinity, right? That's a concept. We know what it is. We have a mathematical definition of sorts of infinity. We can think about it, but it's not really possible to visually experience the infinite, right? We cannot see infinity. And of course, we can't touch or hear infinity. So if this idea doesn't come in through the senses, where did it come from? And is it possible that it is somehow a form of innate knowledge, that we're born with it? It's just inherently in our minds, right? This is called rationalism. And a lot of the Greek philosophers, Plato, Pythagoras, they really were fascinated with mathematics, geometry. This is why you learn about Pythagoras in geometry class for the most part, right? But because of it was the fact that all of these mathematical and geometric concepts represent these kinds of abstract perfections of a sort that they thought, well, the senses only reveal to us things that are imperfect, but our knowledge of higher level perfect things, like the abstractions of mathematics, must be uh, within us already, right? They pre-exist before sensations, right? We're born with it. And that's rationalism, and that tends to be, one way to think about how we know anything is just we're born with it. And we can, of course, take a more modern biological view that somehow what happens is that in the evolution of a species, we also see the evolution of nervous systems and brains, and that means that there's a structure that gets added to the brain through evolution, and the structure of the brain influences the structure of how we understand anything. This is something that another philosopher, Immanuel Kant, had talked about, suggesting that the inherent structure of human consciousness in terms of perceiving space and time is just sort of built into the nature of how the mind works in the first place. And that's been extended into biological theory by suggesting something called biological Kantianism that says that, well, it's just the structure of the brain that creates the way in which we perceive a three-dimensional world changing over time, right? But of course, the idea is that maybe lots of other kinds of knowledge gets embedded into our genes also, right? And so it might be the case then that our ability to recognize other people, right? This is called recognition of conspecifics, right? And we have to think about this as not just from the perspective of human social psychology, but also just at the level of all animal species generally have the ability to recognize other members of the same species. And we might think, oh, is there some sort of instinct that's involved in this? And we look at a lot of other animals that are capable of instincts, like the classic instinct research of Konrad Lorenz, who he found that newly hatched goslings can imprint on their mother on their first day of life because they have some ability to recognize something that is relevant to their survival, and then they follow their mom around, Mother Goose, from their first day of life after they hatch in the nest, right? So in these kinds of situations, we think, oh, it's instinctual, and therefore it's a perceptual ability, but it's something that's built into the genes, clearly, right? Well, so that could be part of rationalism as well. It's not just the old Greek philosophy stuff, right? But and certainly we need to include this kind of stuff in theories of how perception works. But it's not just appealing to this by itself is not a theory or explanation of perception, right? If we simply just say that how do we perceive the world because it's instinct, it's embedded into our DNA, and that's how we can perceive the world, that's really not an answer at all. It's just simply kind of pushing the answer aside and saying, well, how do we do it? Because we can do it, right? We just evolved the ability to do it. And well, if that's not an explanation, so what we need to do is to say, well, it's one thing to say that, so there could be some information embedded into the DNA, but what we also need to explain is how that information got embedded into our genome in the first place. And that presumably still would have required experiential processes and therefore perceptual processes in previous species, our ancestors, right? So what we also then need to say is that, well, we still need a theory of experience, and that means we need empiricism. We need a theory for, that's the view here at the bottom, that knowledge is learned, knowledge is acquired through the senses. And so we need theories of learning. And of course, we can, I say, but not conditioning, meaning that, well, there's classical conditioning and there's operant conditioning, and these are learning theories that we're going to need to explain things. But when it comes to perception as a form of learning, which is what it is, right? Because I acquire experiences and I can store and remember those experiences, and that's something that's more than simply just classical and operant conditioning, right? And I need to also learn the meaning of my experiences. So again, when I talked about recognition before, there might be certain shapes and patterns that I associate with specific kinds of objects like chairs. And I determine what those essential features are. And then I have to start to be able to understand, okay, any object that possesses these essential features is a blank, a chair, perhaps, right? And that's what I mean here as when we talk about perception versus sensation. All right, so let's think about this for a second. Sensation is what occurs when external stimulus energy activates our sensory receptors. So in the eye, we have photoreceptors, and these respond to light entering into our eye. And light has different characteristics. It has an intensity in terms of the photonic flux, how many photons enter the eye. And it also has a wavelength. Right? It's just the actual visible spectrum of light, which we'll talk about later. Ranges from about 400 nanometers to over 700 nanometers. And so we can talk about the different physical descriptions of light, and those different physical dimensions or descriptions of light can have differential effects on the photoreceptors. And then the photoreceptors take that information, which is essentially just a bunch of data that is encoded about the intensity and wavelength of the light, and it has to turn that into, oh, I'm looking at a chair, right? And so the mere fact that we can talk about having millions of photoreceptors in the eyes that are individually encoding details about light energy and light wavelength, and then somehow turn that into chair versus dog or whatever it might be. That's the real challenge. And that's the difference between sensation and perception, right? So sensation is what happens at that initial contact with the world. Light stimulates photoreceptors, and photoreceptors encode some information about the light rays. But we have to take all of that data and essentially decode it, right? We might think that what happens is the eye encodes information about patterns of light, and then that encoded information is sent to the brain, and the brain then has to decode that data to say what kind of object in the world could have created that particular pattern of data. And maybe that object would be a chair, right? So then this is a theory of perception to figure out exactly how the brain decodes the light data coming from the eyes. But it's also a theory of learning, because presumably we are not born with the innate ability to decode that data coming from our eyes, right? We have to learn how to decode the light data. In fact, one of the earliest psychologists, William James, once described, I'm going to butcher this quote since I don't have it sitting in front of me and I'm just kind of, thinking of this on the fly, but he described the perceptual experience of infants who have yet to have perhaps learned to decode their sensory data from all of their sensory organs as this blooming, buzzing confusion, right? Meaning just their perceptual experience must just be, seemingly just a random, blooming, buzzing world of sensations without coherence, without form, without recognizable pattern. And therefore, they can't quite start piecing things together to get at objects, right? So this places a little bit of a limit on exactly, how much they're able to understand the world, except over time, through some form of learning process, that blooming, buzzing confusions does start to obtain some degree of order and coherence, and then they're able to start recognizing objects. What happens there is a theory we would need of what we could call perceptual development. That's a little beyond our scope of here. We're not going to be developmental psychologists as well as perceptual psychologists here, though it'd be nice if we had enough time for all of that. But if you've had developmental psychology, you should know that when Piaget starts describing the concept of a schema, and what happens is that as children develop their schemas, it's based on limited experience, and it sometimes leads them to successfully interpret the world around them, but it also leads them to make mistakes. But they learn from those mistakes, and through that they accommodate or assimilate, right? And that means sometimes they have to change their schemas. That's what accommodation is. And so by building out the schema more and more, they are then able to better interpret and understand the world. And that's what Piaget's theory, especially in that first year of life, that is called the sensory motor stage, is really literally a theory to explain how the senses start learning how to work, right? So I think we have probably gone on long enough to for this first lecture here. This is already long. So I'm going to stop it here, and we will pick it up next time by addressing that question that I said was not super critical. It might be mildly interesting, which is, are there really just 5 senses?